Good afternoon, this is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV. Welcome into our live show where we're going to break down some of the most interesting cases in policing from the last week or so. So just real curious to see where people are watching from today. It looks like we have Brilliant Disguise from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Brilliant Disguise, one of the cases that we're going to cover is from Santa Fe. So I think it's the third one that we're going to talk about today. So definitely stay tuned for that. We got Autistic Shill from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Rich Spillman, good to see you from SoCal as well. All right, so one of the things that we do with this show, we got Kuros from Phoenix, welcome in. One of the things that I really like to do in the show is to get as much participation from our viewers as possible. So while I'm going through some of these cases, if you think that I'm on the right track or wrong track, definitely go ahead and put it in the chat. It's one of the things I like to go back and forth with, to have some dialogue while we're going through some of these just really interesting cases. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Make sure that you share it with family and friends. We usually do this live show on Fridays around lunchtime, usually just after 12 o'clock Mountain Time. And again, my name is Daniel. You can go follow me everywhere over at Police Law News. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about today is, this week there were some different elections that happened all around the country, and what's really not just when it comes to elections in some cities, but also when it comes to just crime policy in general. So over the last couple of years, especially since like 2020, when there was the defund the police movement, there have been some progressive crime policies that on its face just didn't seem like a good idea, that they were obviously going to fail. And, really in the last couple weeks, we've really seen those come to basically where their predictable ending is. And even the voters in a lot of these places that wanted to try out some of these progressive soft on crime ideas, they've decided that they're going to reverse course. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those because that's really important when it comes to policing in the United States. So Oregon. So the state of Oregon, in 2020, they decriminalized small amounts of hard drugs. That was the policy, procedure from the state legislature that they had. And, there's a predictable consequence to bad public policy. That led to just a shit ton of overdoses. What I mean by that is in 2019, Oregon had 84 overdoses due to synthetic opioids. By 2023, so last year, there were 1,100. I mean, that's just an incredible amount. So recently, against last week, the Oregon House passed Bill number 4002, which essentially will make the possession of hard drugs, again, a crime. And, this topic, to me, this just isn't all that complicated. Drugs like alcohol and marijuana and caffeine, maybe those aren't great for people, but you can still have a functioning society if those things are present in society. But things like heroin, meth, and fentanyl, you can't have a functioning society if people are on those kinds of drugs. So we should treat them as such. So it seems like the voters in Oregon have changed course on that. Also, there was a couple ballot measures in San Francisco. So, and one of the reasons why is because last year, 806 people died from overdoses. 806 people died from overdoses in San Francisco last year. So there were a couple propositions that actually passed a couple days ago. Now, again, this is San Francisco, like literally the most progressive people voting. And here's what they voted for. They voted for Prop E. Basically, what Prop E did is it basically gave more latitude for police surveillance, more leeway for police officers involved in pursuits. It gave police more access, the ability to utilize drones in pursuits, less documentation of low-level uses of force when police officers are involved in them, and also a limited oversight from the Civilian Police Commission. Also, they approved Prop F, which essentially required adults who received cash assistance to be screened for drugs. And in these cases where these people getting government funds, if they test positive for drugs, they are forced to enter into treatment. Otherwise, they lose those government benefits. I mean, it's almost like Ben Shapiro was the one who wrote these laws that the voters of San Francisco ended up passing. And then in New York City. So New York City, I think everybody heard about this. So Democrat Governor Kathy Hochul, she just implemented, because of rising crime and violence in the New York subway system, she just deployed 750 members of the National Guard to the subways and also 250 members of the state police and transit officers, basically to combat rising crime in the subways. And I'm not sure if National Guardsmen in the subway system checking people's bags, if that's really the answer to all this. I mean, it certainly isn't a long-term answer to really any of this, especially crime in New York. The thing is that New York City, the people there, they already know how to stop crime and to lower crime. It's called broken windows. This is what was implemented in the 1990s, really when Giuliani came in from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. This was a crime control strategy that was utilized. And, I can just say that, but the numbers speak for themselves. So in 1990, New York City had 2,605 murders. By 2000, they had 952 murders. And I know what a lot of people say. They say, well, crime was going down everywhere. So this really correlation doesn't mean that it actually caused the thing to lower, the crime to lower. But yes, crime was going down across the nation, but it didn't go down that far. 2,600 murders down to 950 a year. Again, that drop in crime was directly, I think, because of broken windows policing. Essentially, what that is it's basically it's the theory that was invented by sociologist James Q. Wilson, and he basically says that if you address the signs of social decay, such as a broken window, if you address those smaller signs of social decay, and that the likelihood that bigger crime is going to happen in those areas, there's a lower chance of that. It was the best example in New York City is in the subways. The people were jumping turnstiles. Now, that's a petty offense. That's a small crime. But what they were able to find is when police officers arrested people and were aggressive in enforcing those laws, there were less assaults and robberies and violent crime in the subways, because it turns out that the people who were committing the small crimes were the same people who were committing the violent crimes. And yes, maybe you don't catch them in the act of robbing someone at gunpoint, but if you could get 20 of them who are jumping turnstiles so they don't have that opportunity, that's really the way to do that. So we have a couple comments here. Let's see. Andrea Park says, shoot spaces. Here where you can use drugs, except you cannot smoke a cigarette in Australia. Rich Spielman says, Frisco passes out meth pipes. And Steve Lander says it's okay for people to pour across the Rio Grande, and it's suspicious if residents travel to and from work. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable. That is a reasonable criticism there. All right, so the first officer-involved shooting that we're going to talk about, it also happened in New York City, and this is pretty typical of officer-involved shootings. I know that I say that, and a lot of times on this channel we cover controversial officer-involved shootings because, again, there are approximately 1,000 fatal officer-involved shootings, throughout the country every single year. Total officer-involved shootings are probably around 1,500 to 2,000 a year. And, the ones that are just, we know for sure that these are justified shootings, a lot of times there isn't a whole lot to talk about. So the ones that not only the mainstream media, but that we like to cover here are the ones where there's some argument on, where I can argue, this is a legal shooting, and someone else could say, well, I don't think it's a legal shooting. And, both people might have, there is some reasonable debate in what happened in this case. However, this is a case that I'm going to cover that there's no doubt that this is a legal and reasonable officer-involved shooting. So again, this happened in New York City on December 23rd, and we actually just got the body camera video from it. So let me tell you what happened. There was a 911 call where someone called police officers, and they said that a man had a knife and that he was on drugs and he was violent. And that's really all that the police officers had, is that a guy who was on drugs and violent had on drugs and violent was armed with a knife. So police officers get to the apartment complex. They get there. They can hear people inside the apartment, and they're knocking on the door. They're announcing that they're New York police. No one is responding. Eventually, they try to open the door. Eventually, the door opens up, and a woman just streams out. She runs out, and as she runs out, she has slash marks on her face. So she had been slashed in the face with a knife. It turns out that is the offender's girlfriend, and she was actually able to escape at that point. So now the police officers, they don't know who else. Yes, they have one person who is definitely injured run out of the apartment right past them, but again, they have an offender and they don't know who else might be inside that apartment. So police officers then enter the apartment, and here's what they see. They see the offender, 30-year-old man named Michael Dotel, and they see that he is armed with a large carving knife and he has his mother in a headlock. And that's a pretty dangerous situation for the victim to be in. Obviously, she's in a headlock. She could lose consciousness at that point. And because the police officer at that point had evidence that Mr. Dotel had already, slashed his girlfriend in the face because they saw her run out with slash marks, is that he's also holding this large carving knife right by his mother who is in a headlock. Police officers did give him multiple commands, and his response to those commands, instead of dropping the knife and cooperating with police officers, his response to the commands to, drop the knife and get down on the ground, put your hands in the air, his response to that was, "I have a knife, shoot me." Well, that's exactly what a police officer did. Just about as the victim, who is in a headlock, who is his mother, was about to lose consciousness, she later testified or later said that she was just losing consciousness. It was that point that the police officer did fire one shot. It was a headshot. Mr. Dotel fell to the ground, and he did die from his injuries. That's a really difficult shot for police officers to make, because you have to think about it. Not only are you under stress, so anytime you do anything that's under stress, no matter if it's driving or playing a sport or definitely in a deadly force situation, here you are under stress, and now you're having to make a headshot with not just a headshot for the offender, but the victim is literally right there. So this was an incredible shot by that police officer, and this only goes to the fact that police officers need more training. I mean, this is really like a Hollywood type shooting. You typically don't see stuff like this. Most police officers go through an entire career, 20 or 30 years, and are never involved in an officer-involved shooting. Again, I was with the Albuquerque Police Department for almost 2 decades before I retired. I made 3,000 arrests. I was never involved in an officer-involved shooting. That's a good thing. And most police officers, they fall into that category of making a lot of arrests and never being involved in an officer-involved shooting. And the ones who are involved in officer-involved shootings, it's very rare that you have to make a headshot in order to save a hostage's life, because the offender is holding them at knife point. So that is something that's very rare. This did end the way that it was supposed to. Obviously, any loss of life is tragic, but this is clearly a reasonable, lawful, and justified officer-involved shooting, and the officer did save that mom's life. And listen, I know what a lot of you are thinking, that they should have just called a social worker. I get it. Let's see if we have any comments on this case. Let's see. Steve says, a normal person doesn't want to dig through other people's stuff. I agree. Yeah, I agree. Stealing stuff is bad. Ethan wants to talk about what's going on with the Albuquerque Police Department. We will cover that at some point. The investigation is kind of ongoing, so kind of want to see where this ends up before we talk too much about that. I kind of want to see where that case ends up. Rich Spillman said, my dad did 22 years, unholstered his gun twice. Dad had no shots fired. Yeah, I think that's about correct, Rich. Again, most police, and then just because an officer is involved in officer investigation doesn't mean that they did anything bad. Just like with any kind of use of force, use of force from a police officer, whether it's having to use a taser or a beanbag shotgun or deadly force, the vast majority of the time, like 99% of the time, it is due 100% in reaction to what the offender is doing. Because again, as everybody knows, if you just cooperate and you act like a normal, reasonable person, even if you disagree with what the police officer is doing, as long as you don't fight with the police officer, flee, run, try to shoot the police officer or anybody else, as long as you don't do those things, the likelihood statistically of you being harmed by a police officer are incredibly low. All right, so the next case that we're going to talk about did happen in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I think when I said Santa Fe earlier, people thought that I might be talking about the Rust case, and I can't cover that if you want. So let me talk about that really quick, because when I said Santa Fe, I think that's what a lot of people thought. So Rust was a movie that was being shot just outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, a low-budget Western movie that was written, produced, and starring Alec Baldwin. During during the filming of this, Alec Baldwin is a Trump impersonator extraordinaire, which makes this all the more strange. And during this, during the filming of this, Alec Baldwin had a gun, and it was a prop gun, but it was still a real gun. He thought that there were not live rounds in the gun. Apparently, there was a live round in the gun, and Alec Baldwin while they were preparing for a scene, did fire the gun. He did shoot, and he killed I think it was the cinematographer, and he also shot the director as well. So there are a bunch of people who were charged in that case. Hannah Rees Gutierrez was she was basically the armorer on scene. So she was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and she was actually went to trial this past week, and she was actually convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Essentially, basically, what the bare bones of this case came down to is that there were live rounds on set, and there shouldn't have been. And essentially what the jury decided is that it was her job. It was Hannah Reed Gutierrez. It was her job to make sure that there were no live rounds on set. That was her job. So she was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. She faces a maximum penalty of 18 months. Now, Alec Baldwin is also facing involuntary manslaughter charges. He will go to trial this July. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who are like the obvious question, at least that I've been asking, and that a lot of people would want is like, okay, well, now that the armorer has been convicted, is that good news for Alec Baldwin, or is that bad news for Alec Baldwin? How does his case, how does his defense attorney see this? And I can really make an argument both ways, and then I'm going to tell you what I think. So when it comes to whether or not, let's say this is good for Alec Baldwin. So basically that theory would look like, okay, Alec Baldwin is the producer and the actor, and he hired someone. He paid Hannah Gutierrez Reed money to do a specific job that she was qualified and certified to do, and that's to make sure that all the props on scene, for lack of a better term, were safe. Certainly to make sure that there were no live rounds in the prop gun or in any of the firearms on scene that the actors were going to be using. He basically said, hey, I have a lot going on. I'm trying to produce this whole movie, and I'm acting in it. This very important safety part, I didn't take that on myself. I gave it to someone who is certified by whatever body that she's certified from in order to do this particular job. She did a bad job. It's her fault. I'm not just saying she did a bad job. A jury convicted her of being careless. So I didn't expect her to be careless. I didn't expect her to be reckless. I hired her. She is supposed to be a professional. A jury convicted her in this case. So of course it's not my fault. Of course, it's not my fault. The jury has already decided whose fault it is. So that's the argument that his team is probably going to make. But here's the other side of this. The other side of this is that Hannah Gutierrez Reed, the armorer, she was convicted in this case. But here's why I don't think it's great for Alec Baldwin, is because they assigned some fault. There is recklessness. There is carelessness. There is some criminal fault there because of her conviction. Now, what they're going to say is, Alec Baldwin, you were not just an actor on scene who was handed a gun. You were the producer. You did the hiring. You were in charge of this whole thing, and essentially you created an environment where people felt that they couldn't, the people were afraid of you on scene, and essentially the other actors and the people who worked like the armorer and the cinematographer and all of the other extras, the extra people who worked on scene, they didn't feel comfortable in letting you know how unsafe this was, even though you should have known. So you were careless, and you went and you blew off, and there's evidence in text messages that you blew off meetings, that you didn't attend a safety course that you were supposed to. You are on camera doing a couple interviews where you said that you never pulled the trigger, which we know that isn't true. And again, if that isn't true, well, how much else that he might say, or of evidence that might be produced of him basically defending himself, how much of that isn't going to be true either? So that's why I don't think it was a good day for Alec Baldwin. So I think it's still an uphill battle to try to convict him. I always thought that the armorer, had the most liability, criminal liability. I always thought was probably going to be with her. her, and that if anyone was convicted, it was going to be her. But now that she was convicted, I actually think that it's more likely that Alec Baldwin might be convicted as well. All right, Cajun Randy says, with that logic, police chiefs should be charged with the crimes that the cops under them commit. Not really, Randy. Though what I can say is that if a police chief creates a situation where, something like this happened, could a police chief be charged? Could a sergeant on scene be charged? And that's really what I'm going to relate it to, Randy. So there are different cases. I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but there have been multiple different cases where sergeants on scene or lieutenants on scene who actually weren't the ones who fired the shot, but were there on scene, who weren't doing things safely, who weren't, in lack of a better term, reining in the officer on scene. They were actually charged in that case. So that does actually happen. Cajun Randy, even if you look at the George Floyd case, so Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck, back, or shoulder. The other officers didn't, but the other officers were charged as well. And again, they were charged as well with failing to intervene on the state and the federal level. So that kind of stuff does happen in policing. But it's pretty rare that it happens, but it does happen, and that's why we're talking about the Alec Baldwin case, because it's rare as well. So the other case from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and again, I did just retire from a police department here in New Mexico, so I like talking about cases that happen here in the state, because this is a weird state. So this is the case. I don't know how many people have been following it, but I'm also on TikTok, and this is also have been in the local news. So I've been following this case because I think it's pretty interesting. It's a little silly. All right, so this guy's name is Eldon Hamby. He's a 29-year-old on TikTok. He runs a TikTok channel called Get the Stick. He's 29 years old. He works part-time at a dry cleaners. And he would do some videos on TikTok, comedy videos with some of his friends. He would do with some of his friends, and he had just under 100,000 followers on TikTok. I think he had 80,000 or 70,000 followers, which is pretty good. So the first time I started a TikTok account before I got banned, I had 144,000 followers on TikTok, which is pretty good. That's a decent amount. So he had a decent following making his funny, silly comedy videos. Well, what happened is he was working or really just helping out part-time at a dry cleaner shop that his friend was working at. So his friend works at this dry cleaners in Santa Fe, and essentially what happened is a New Mexico State police officer came in to get his uniform dry cleaned at this place of business. And apparently this is a pretty, popular place where police officers would take their uniforms to. Well, instead of the uniform just kind of going through the normal thing and getting, dry cleaned, Eldon Hamby, who was there, kind of helping out his friend, what he decided to do with that state police uniform is he decided to put it on and make TikTok videos in that uniform. He got incredible views. If you go through his channel, a lot of his videos did get 30,000 views, 50,000 views, but these ones where he's being silly in dancing around in an official New Mexico State Police uniform, those were getting hundreds of thousands of views. So he went from 70,000 followers to 115,000 followers, pretty much overnight. Listen, the state police, they take their uniform and their traditions pretty seriously. So obviously this got around. This went to state police, and this is what's being reported is that state police officers, essentially, went to the business, and they did some research, and they were able to find out who did this. They basically made contact with Mr. Hamby, and at first they weren't going to file any kind of a charges. They basically said, hey, listen, you're wearing a state police uniform, you shouldn't have been wearing it. All we want you to do is to take the videos down. Take the videos down. We're not going to charge you. And apparently he agreed to that. He told the state police officers that he would go ahead and take the videos down, but he never did. So time went on. He didn't take the videos down. Then the local news got a hold of this whole thing. Brilliant Disguise says his videos weren't even that funny. I agree. Brilliant Disguise, I don't think he's funny. And again, I like comedy. I don't think this guy's very funny at all. So you know what? The local news got a hold of it, and after not taking the videos down, the state police went ahead and charged him with a misdemeanor crime of unauthorized wearing of a police uniform or badge. So they went ahead and charged him with that misdemeanor crime. Now listen. Now on this crime, I'm going to be just as transparent as I could be. I think it's a little weak. I really don't think that he's going to be convicted of this crime, and here's why. Because one of the elements to this crime is that the person isn't just wearing that uniform, it's that they are representing themselves as a member of the New Mexico State Police. Now, because it's an obvious comedy sketch, it's obviously a joke, I guess no reasonable person watching his videos would ever think that he's a New Mexico State police officer. So if no reasonable, so here will be his defense. If no reasonable person would think that he's an actual New Mexico State police officer and it's clearly a joke, then he's not really representing himself as a New Mexico State police officer. So that's a pretty big element in this crime. So for that reason, I absolutely do not think he's going to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. I think it's a pretty weak charge. What he decided to do is he hired an attorney and he filed a civil rights lawsuit, basically saying that there's a violation of his First Amendment rights. I also think that's pretty weak. I don't think that lawsuit is going to go anywhere, and here's why. It's because, yes, everybody has the right to free speech, and the thing is, his speech, what he was saying, his speech is not the reason he's being prosecuted. The reason that he's being prosecuted is because of, he was not authorized to wear the official New Mexico State Police uniform, and that's why he's being prosecuted. You do have a constitutional right. You absolutely have a constitutional right to free speech, but you do not have a constitutional right to play dress up as a police officer. You just don't. So I don't think that civil lawsuit is going to go anywhere. Now, whenever I look at these cases, I kind of see, okay, like who's the winner and who's the loser in this case. So I think to wrap this up, two things can be true. One, he will not be convicted, and I think that's probably legally correct. And two, his civil lawsuit isn't going to go anywhere because, again, it's not a violation of any kind of rights because, you can't. Just like Rich Spillman just said, you can't borrow or steal. I mean, again, there's no argument that he was authorized to wear this uniform. But here's what I'm going to say. Let's say he bought the New Mexico State Police uniform on eBay or something like that. You know what? Then, and if they want to go after him then, or let's say a friend who works though my guess is he has no friends who are actual police officers, but let's say a friend let him borrow that uniform and gave him permission to wear it. Well, then I would say, you know what? Maybe he does have a point. But again, the uniform was brought in to the dry cleaners. He had no permission to wear it. So again, it's because he's wearing the uniform. It's not because of what he said. So I don't think his civil lawsuit is going anywhere. But I'd like to talk about winners and losers. So who's the loser? The loser is the dry cleaning business, which really sucks for them because, again, they hired this guy who then let his friend, this guy on TikTok, help out. And this is what happened. The friend, he actually went on the news. He actually went on the news and he actually went on the news and said that, I didn't know my friend was going to do this. I should point out that, if he's convicted, which is unlikely, that he can go ahead and share a cell with Alec Baldwin. I think that would be a lot of fun. I think that would make for some great TikTok videos there. But so that's the loser, the dry cleaners, because this is just a business who, it wasn't the business owner who did this. It wasn't the manager who did this. It was like a friend of an employee who did this. And again, if you're a police officer in the state or any kind of a professional person, like, are you going to bring your dry cleaners there? Are you going to bring your clothes there knowing that at some point someone could wear them? I mean, this is like, I think this was in an episode of Seinfeld, right? This was an episode of Seinfeld where it was, Jerry's mom brought in a coat or something, the person's wearing it. So I mean, again, this is like from a sitcom in the 90s that something like this would happen. So that's the loser. The dry cleaning business is the loser. Who's the winner? The winner is the guy on TikTok, Hamby. He's the winner in all this. Again, he's mildly funny, and that's being generous to say that he's mildly funny, and he is basically getting outsized attention for the level of what his content should be. He's the winner in all this. So again, as someone who also creates content on TikTok and on Instagram, and I do the show, good for him, I guess, because I don't think he's going to be convicted. His civil lawsuit isn't going anywhere, but there is at least one local news. I mean, and when I say local, because New Mexico is a pretty, small state when it comes to population, the three major news channels in this state are basically broadcasting stories about him every single week. This is a win for him. Okay, all right, and let's see if we have any comments on this. Let's see. Cajun Randy says they didn't like what he was saying with his comedy. Maybe Cajun Randy, but again, he's not being prosecuted because of what he's saying. It's for the unauthorized wearing of the uniform. And again, the way that the statute's written, it's that he has to represent himself. And I don't think he was representing himself because it was comedy. So again, I think it's that gray area where, yeah, I mean, he I don't think it's a violation of his civil rights to charge him with this, but I also don't think he's guilty of the letter of the law because I don't think he was representing himself. I think it was obviously a joke. Steve says, charging him with a crime proves his point and just how stupid they are. Well, that wasn't his point, Steve. I think you should go back and watch his videos. He wasn't trying to make a point that police are stupid at all. Go and watch his videos. He's not really like degrading police. I think he's just being funny. If anything, I think what he's doing is he's more, making fun of how people in northern New Mexico talk. And I think that's what a lot of his videos are about. It's basically not making fun of cops, but making fun of people who live in northern New Mexico. Let's see. Rich Spillman, thank you. Brilliant disguise. I think his friend worked at the dry cleaners, let him use the uniform for videos. He got fired. Yeah, absolutely. Kuro says he should have used an obvious fake uniform like a Reno 911 show. I agree, Kuros. Yeah, that's what he should have done. And my guess is that this guy, Hamby, he's not a bad guy, okay? That's my guess. And my guess is he didn't wake up one day and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go help my friend out at the dry cleaners, just kind of hang out in the back, smoke some weed, and, hopefully New Mexico State police officer will drop off his uniform, and I'm going to put it on, and I'm going to dance around. I don't think that's what he intended to do. I mean, to me, this seems like I don't think it was a crime, but, for lack of a better term, this is like a crime of opportunity. Like, he was there, he saw the uniform, he just decided he was bored and just decided to throw it on. Let's see. Steve says, I'll bet that dry cleaner business made more money because most people are sick of police. Actually not, Steve. Like I said, so the friend who let him do this was fired, and from everything that I'm hearing is that the dry cleaner business is hurting. They are the loser in all this. Even if you don't think he should be charged with a crime, most people who bring their clothes to a dry cleaner don't want the employees wearing the clothes or making videos in their clothes. So I think that's pretty much a standard. Even if people have problems with police, which in Santa Fe they really don't. I mean, Santa Fe is a pretty liberal place, but they actually have a really good and progressive police department that really has a lot of support from the community. And because of it, they're actually one of the highest paid agencies in the state. So Santa Fe police really haven't had any controversial officer-involved shootings or anything like that. So they actually have pretty good community support there. And again, even people who don't like cops also do not want their dry cleaners to be wearing their clothes and stuff like that. I think Santa Fe police is also switching to like electric vehicles. So again, it's like the hatred for police. I'm not really seeing it a whole lot in Santa Fe, and I live about an hour from there. So okay, so the last case that I'm going to talk about, this is a tragic case. And we finally got some justice in this case, though. Again, nothing is going to bring this officer back. So I'm going to wrap this up because this was a case that happened back in August of 21. Chicago police officer Ella French, she was the 29-year-old police officer. Her and two other police officers, Officer Blas and Officer Yanez, they stopped a vehicle for expired license plates in just a real shitty area of town. And I'm from Chicago. I think I've told people that before. I lived in Chicago for 22 years before I moved out to the Southwest to become a police officer. My family still lives in Chicago. This area is so shitty. My mom has lived in Chicago for 75 years now. In 75 years, she's never gone to this neighborhood. I lived in Chicago 22 years. I never went into this neighborhood once in my life because it's just a place you just don't go. So that's the kind of area that the officers were patrolling, a really dangerous area. It was so dangerous that 3 officers conducted this traffic stop, which is pretty normal in the area of Chicago with a lot of violence and homicides. So these 3 police officers, including Officer French, conducted a traffic stop on a vehicle for expired license plates back in August of 21. The vehicle is driven by brothers, Amote Morgan, or whatever the fuck you say his name, Amote Morgan and Eric Morgan. Once the traffic stop occurred, Eric ran from the car. Amote started to fight with police officers. During the fight with police officers, Amote pulled out a gun and he shot 2 of the officers. He shot and killed Officer Ella French, and he shot Officer Yanez, who suffers serious injuries and is now paralyzed from his injuries. Earlier this year, Eric, the one who read, he actually pled guilty to, because he was actually part of it as well, so he pled guilty to, I think, aggravated battery. He pled guilty. He's serving 7 years, but the guy who pulled the trigger is Amote. He went to trial this week, and he was actually found guilty of murder and other charges. I think the jury only needed like 2.5 or 3 hours to deliberate. I mean, it's on body camera video, it's on surveillance video. Again, like there's no ambiguity here. It's on video what happened. But so he was convicted, which is absolutely what should have happened, and we need some justice for Officer French. And right after the verdict, his mother. If you ever wonder, like, how do people become just absolute pieces of shit? Like his mother, after the verdict, she was talking to the news, and she basically did a whole rant about how it was a cover-up, and how she was the one who was hurting, and she was still fighting for justice. I just want to say that she's not the victim. Amote is not the victim. They are the fucking problem. And I think that's pretty obvious to everyone. And Ella French is finally getting some justice. I should also mention in that case, the dispatcher, it's just basically just a master class in being a dispatcher in a critical scene. He did an incredible job. I think since then he has left the police department, and I know at one point he was running for city council in Chicago. I don't know if he made it or not. But if you ever go back, Ella French, listen to that dispatch log, and it is absolutely incredible. All right, let's see. Let's see if we have any other questions before we take off for today. Autistic Shill says, I used to work at a dry cleaners when I was 18. You bet I'd be fired if I ever would have done that. I wouldn't want to wear their clothing. That's just weird. I agree. It's pretty weird. But again, like I'm not trying to defend this guy because I think he's an idiot for doing this. Obviously, I just don't think he committed a crime. I don't think he committed. Technically, I don't think he committed a crime. But his civil rights weren't violated. But again, he's the big winner in this. He is now being talked about on national shows and national media, when again, in my opinion, his content isn't all that good. It's a little funny, but it's not that funny. So he's getting outsized attention. Let's see. Steve says, where I live, a restaurant refused to serve an officer and the police union cried like children. That restaurant businesses almost doubled overnight. Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff happens, Steve. I think that people who own businesses, really should be able to refuse service to people if they want, including police officers. I just think that capitalism should take its place. And that has happened before, Steve, where sometimes, at least what I've seen in the national news, if there was a story about it, Steve, why don't you go ahead and put it in the chat? I'm real curious to look at it, because in the past, when that's happened in different places, it's happened here in Albuquerque, it's happened around the country in a couple different Starbucks locations as well. Typically what happens is the business comes out immediately, apologizes, and fires that employee. So that's usually what happened. Usually businesses aren't seen as heroes when this kind of stuff happens. But if that did happen, I'm curious to see if that's the case or not. Let's see. Brilliant Disguise says, please look into Dalton, Illinois Police Department and their mayor, Tiffany Henyard. Oh, I absolutely will, and I know about that case. Brilliant Disguise. I will go ahead and talk about that. Last week I've been following that case as well. Rich Spillman said, good show. All right, well, that's going to be it for this week. I hope everybody has a great and safe weekend. And like I said, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please go ahead. Or you can go ahead and follow me for daily content over at Police Law News. I do follow the chat throughout the week, so even if there is a case you think is interesting, you want to go ahead and put in the chat, go ahead and do that. I will correspond throughout the week. And again, I hope everyone has a safe weekend. Thanks.